It was 8:12 on a rainy Thursday morning when I walked into the glass-walled boardroom on the 14th floor. I had been told it was a routine restructuring review. I wore my navy blazer, carried my notebook, and took a seat at the far end of a long table. Around me sat the executive board, 5 people with the power to reshape the company with a single vote. My manager, Victor Hale, stood at the front of the room with a laser pointer and a confidence that had always made me slightly uncomfortable. He clicked through slides with smooth, rehearsed energy. Numbers, charts, projections. Then he reached a slide with my department's name on it. He paused just long enough. After careful analysis, Victor said, his voice perfectly level, we have determined this department can be significantly streamlined. He clicked again. A new slide appeared. My name was on it. Daniel's role specifically is easily replaceable. Several board members glanced down at their notes. Nobody pushed back. Nobody asked a follow-up question. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, hands folded in front of me, and I listened without expression as 11 years of careful, honest work were reduced to a single budget decision. And I said absolutely nothing. I want you to understand something about the kind of worker I was before I tell you what happened next. I was not flashy. I did not send emails at midnight just so people would see the timestamp. I did not fight for credit in meetings or make sure my name appeared on every document I contributed to. I was a kind of person companies quietly depend on without fully realizing it. For 11 years, I had been an operations specialist at Cortland Solutions. My official job was to manage client accounts and coordinate internal delivery timelines. But what I actually did was far more than that description suggests. I fixed problems before they became visible. I caught mistakes in contracts before anyone signed them. When executives made promises to clients that the delivery team could not keep, I was the one who quietly found a way to make those promises real anyway. I worked weekends that nobody knew about. I took calls during family dinners and apologized to my wife, Nina, with the same tired expression she had long stopped commenting on. I was not doing it for recognition or reward. I did it because I genuinely cared. That I eventually understood was the thing Victor Hale had completely misjudged about me. My colleague Priya pulled me aside in the hallway after the meeting. She was one of the few people at Cortland I genuinely trusted. "Are you okay?" she asked, studying my face carefully, as if she expected to find something cracked beneath the surface. "I'm fine," I said, and I meant it completely. She did not believe me. "Victor set this up," she said quietly, leaning close so no one passing by could hear. "He has been building this case against you for months, telling the board your department is overstaffed and consistently underperforming." I nodded slowly. "I know." She looked at me with visible frustration. "Then why haven't you done anything about it?" I gave her a small, measured smile. "Who says I haven't?" She started to respond, then stopped herself. The elevator behind us opened and 2 board members stepped out, deep in conversation. Priya and I parted without another word. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and opened my laptop. On my screen was an unread notification from a client portal I had been quietly monitoring for several weeks. I read it, closed the tab, and leaned back in my chair. Then I turned my phone face down, folded my hands behind my head, and stared at the ceiling for exactly 30 seconds. Victor Hale had been with Cortland Solutions for 3 years. In that time, he had built a reputation that was, on the surface, deeply impressive. He spoke the language of growth and disruption fluently. He made bold promises in board presentations and delivered on them, at least in the short term, with a kind of forward energy that made senior executives feel safe placing their confidence in him. What they did not see, because Victor was very careful about what they were allowed to see, was how he actually produced his results. He borrowed ideas from his team and presented them as his own original thinking. He took internal reports drafted by people like me and repackaged them under his branding with my name removed from the cover. He built alliances by identifying what each senior leader privately feared and positioning himself as the solution to that fear. For at least a year before the boardroom meeting, he had been systematically sidelining everyone either too competent to control or too honest to manipulate. When it was my turn, I was not surprised. What Victor had never anticipated was that while he had been moving carefully against me, I had been watching just as carefully and preparing. The company's largest client was a logistics firm called Barwell Group. They had been with Cortland Solutions for 7 years, and their contract represented nearly a third of the company's annual revenue. Nobody on the executive board ever discussed that number lightly. My relationship with Barwell Group was not a professional formality. It had been built across years of small, significant moments that added up to something unusually real for a business relationship. Their operations director, a sharp and straightforward man named Felix Adeyemi, had worked with me directly through 2 major crises. The first time, a delivery failure threatened to end the relationship entirely. I flew to their offices personally, sat across from Felix, and was completely honest about what had gone wrong and exactly how it would be fixed. He respected that directness. The second time, a pricing dispute had escalated toward potential legal action. I spent 3 weeks quietly negotiating a resolution that protected both companies. When it was over, Felix called me. "Daniel," he said, "as long as you are at Cortland, we are staying." I thanked him simply. I had never used that statement as leverage in the years since, but I had never forgotten it. 8 months before the boardroom meeting, I had quietly prevented what would have been the worst compliance disaster in the company's history. It began with a routine contract renewal. Reviewing the updated service agreement for Barwell Group, I noticed a clause that had been silently altered, not by me and not with my knowledge. The revised language transferred data storage responsibilities to Cortland in a way that violated 3 separate industry regulations. Had that contract been signed, the company would have faced serious audits, substantial financial penalties, and a genuine risk of losing its operating license in 2 major markets. I flagged it through the legal team immediately, carefully, without broadcasting the problem company-wide or embarrassing the person responsible for the change. The issue was corrected within 4 days. Leadership never learned it had happened. I saved copies of every email connected to that incident, every draft, every revision, every timestamp, and stored them in 3 separate locations. At the time, I had assumed the altered clause was an honest administrative mistake. Months later, reviewing everything again more slowly, I began to seriously wonder whether it had been. Either way, those files were now exactly where I needed them. 3 days after the boardroom meeting, Victor called a company-wide gathering on the operations floor. He stood at the front and announced the restructuring formally, department by department, with a controlled calm clearly designed to make any form of pushback seem unreasonable. When he reached my department, his delivery became especially deliberate. "We'll be transitioning Daniel's responsibilities to a newly configured team," he said, not once making direct eye contact with me. "Daniel will remain available to support the handover process over the next 4 weeks. In other words, I would spend a month training the people hired to replace me. We genuinely appreciate Daniel's contributions over the years. This is entirely a structural decision." I looked slowly around the room. Several colleagues quickly avoided my eyes. Others gave me small, visibly uncomfortable glances. One junior team member, a young woman named Amara, who had joined us only 18 months earlier, looked genuinely distressed. I caught her eye and gave her the smallest nod I could. I was not going to come apart in front of these people. I was not going to give Victor the reaction he may or may not have been hoping for. I nodded, said nothing, and returned quietly to my desk. It was exactly 57 minutes after the restructuring announcement when my desk phone rang. I recognized the extension immediately, our client services line, the one connected directly to the Barwell Group account. I picked up on the second ring. "Daniel." It was Felix Adeyemi's voice, and the tone in it told me everything I needed to know before a second word was spoken. "We have a serious problem. A bulk shipment of time-sensitive medical supply components that Barwell Group was contractually obligated to deliver to 3 regional hospital networks by Friday morning, had been flagged by their automated compliance system. The flag had been triggered by errors in the digital documentation submitted 2 days earlier by the new coordination team handling my former responsibilities. The error was technical but the consequence was enormous and unambiguous. If the shipment was not cleared and rerouted within the next 48 hours, Barwell Group would be in direct breach of contract with 3 hospitals. "I need this resolved today," Felix said. "I need someone who actually understands how this system works." "I understand completely," I told him. "Give me 20 minutes. I hung up, picked up my pen, and started writing. Victor was in a glass-walled meeting room with 2 board members when his assistant knocked and entered. I watched it happen from across the open floor through the glass panel. I could not hear the conversation, but I did not need to. Victor's expression shifted in real time, that precisely controlled, confident face moving from composed to visibly tight in the space of about 4 seconds. He stood immediately. He pulled out his phone. He said something brief to the board members and walked quickly out of the room toward the client services floor. I leaned back and waited. 11 minutes passed. Then Priya walked past my desk and leaned down slightly as she went. "Victor is in with the client team right now," she said under her breath. "Barwell Group called and asked specifically where you were." She did not wait for a response. I gave a single nod and kept my eyes on my screen. On that screen, I had already drafted the complete corrective documentation for the Barwell Group compliance flag. 3 clean pages, precisely matched to the required regulatory format. I had not sent it yet, not out of stubbornness, but because how this moment was handled mattered as much as whether it was handled at all. My phone buzzed with a number I had not expected to see. It was a direct line registered to company chairman Howard Blaine. I had met Howard exactly 4 times in 11 years. He was not the type of person who called operations staff directly. I let it ring once more before I answered. "Daniel." His voice was measured and careful, in the way of people who have managed difficult situations for many years. "This is Howard Blaine. I'd like you to come up to the executive floor." "I'll be right up," I said. I closed my laptop, stood up, straightened my jacket, and picked up the folder that had been sitting on the corner of my desk for 3 days. Inside that folder was the corrective documentation for the Barwell Group situation. But it also held something else, something I had been preparing for weeks. Printed copies of the key emails from the compliance incident 8 months earlier. A copy of the service agreement I had personally negotiated with Barwell Group, including every protective clause. And a carefully written, factual summary of every instance in which Victor Hale had presented another person's work as his own. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the 14th floor. The doors closed. I stood straight and breathed steadily. What most people at Cortland Solutions had never known was that the service agreement I personally negotiated with Barwell Group 6 years earlier contained a very specific clause. I had written it myself in the aftermath of the pricing dispute because I wanted both sides to feel genuinely and equally protected. The clause stated plainly that Barwell Group had the right to pause all active operations under the contract and formally request a review if key personnel named within the agreement were removed without adequate notice and proper transition planning. I was one of those named key personnel. My name appeared in that clause specifically because Felix Adeyemi had personally insisted on including it. At the time, I had been quietly honored and mildly embarrassed by the gesture. I had agreed to it, filed the paperwork, and moved on entirely. I had never brought it up during performance reviews or budget discussions or any conversation about my future with the company. It had sat untouched in a contract file for 6 years, known to the legal team that processed it and apparently forgotten by everyone else. Victor Hale had certainly never read the full agreement. I was not going to announce that the clause existed. I was going to wait for exactly the right moment. By the time I stepped off the elevator on the 14th floor, the hallway outside the executive suite already felt different. 2 members of the legal team were standing near the assistant's desk with folders under their arms and quiet expressions. A board member I recognized, Paula Renner, who oversaw compliance matters, was speaking in a low voice to someone I had not seen before. Priya had sent me a message while I was in the elevator. It read, "People are talking. Victor's numbers are not holding up under review." That message confirmed something I had been quietly suspecting for weeks. The board had not been asking the right questions about Victor's department because Victor was exceptionally skilled at making those questions feel unnecessary. But serious crises have a way of making people suddenly curious about things they had previously been comfortable overlooking. The Barwell Group situation had pulled on a loose thread. When a carefully constructed image gets a single thread pulled hard, the entire structure collapses faster than anyone expects. I knocked on Howard Blaine's office door. "Come in," he said. I opened the door and found 3 people already inside. Howard behind his desk, Paula Renner to the left, and the company's external legal counsel seated quietly to the right. Howard Blaine wasted no time. "Barwell Group will not proceed with the current response team. They have asked for you by name." I nodded. "I can resolve the compliance documentation within the hour. The corrective filing is already prepared." I placed the first set of documents on his desk. He reviewed them briefly and passed them to legal counsel. Then I placed the second set on the desk beside the first. "There's something else you should be aware of," I said, keeping my voice calm and level. "The service agreement I negotiated with Barwell Group in 2018 contains a personnel protection clause. Under the terms of that clause, Barwell Group has the formal right to pause operations and request a full review given the personnel changes that have been announced this week." The room went quiet, not because people had nothing to say, but because they were rapidly recalculating everything they thought they understood about the past 3 days. Howard picked up the agreement, located the clause, and read it. He read it a second time. He set it down slowly. "Was Victor Hale aware of this clause?" he asked. "I cannot say whether he was or wasn't," I replied. "I can only confirm that it exists." Paula Renner was already writing something down. The emergency board session was called for 2 o'clock. I was not included in the opening portion. I sat at my desk, completed the corrective compliance documentation for Barwell Group, and sent it to Felix with a brief note. His confirmation arrived 18 minutes later. "Cleared," it read. "Thank you, Daniel. I hope you know what you mean to this entire relationship." I saved the message carefully. At 2:45, Howard's assistant called me upstairs. I walked into a room that felt entirely different from a morning meeting. The energy had shifted from routine procedure to something harder and less controlled. Victor was seated at the middle of the table, composed in the specific way that costs real effort to maintain. Legal counsel was present. Paula Renner had her laptop open in front of her. Bernard Osei, a board member who handled investor relations and rarely attended internal operations meetings, sat at the far end. Victor spoke almost before I had settled. "I want to be entirely clear," he said, his voice still carrying its usual authority. "The documentation error with Barwell Group resulted from insufficient handover planning on Daniel's side. He was fully aware of the transition schedule." He looked directly at me. I looked back. Then I opened my folder and placed the first document on the table. Howard Blaine asked the question, simply and without any preamble. "Who authored the Barwell Group client retention strategy that was presented to this board in March of last year?" Victor did not hesitate even briefly. "That strategy was developed collaboratively by my team, building on a number of existing internal frameworks." "Can you name the specific contributors?" Victor shifted almost imperceptibly in his seat. It was a broad team effort. Howard turned and looked at me. I pulled a document from my folder and placed it on the table. It was the original strategy, time-stamped, version-controlled, with my name clearly visible in the author metadata. Behind it, I placed 3 email chains that showed the document moving from my draft files into Victor's inbox, and then reappearing 2 weeks later in a board presentation carrying his branding and no trace of my name. There was no shouting in the room. There did not need to be. The documents said everything calmly and permanently. Board members leaned forward. Paula Renner's expression moved into something that looked less like surprise and more like a conclusion finally being reached. Victor opened his mouth and then closed it again without speaking. Bernard Osei requested copies of everything. I had prepared those sets weeks earlier and distributed them without a word. During the recess that followed, Priya sent a message that made the entire situation considerably more serious. Victor's restructuring proposal includes outsourcing our core data coordination to an external vendor. The vendor company is registered to a business associate of his. I have the registration documents. I read it twice before responding. What had appeared to be a story about professional ambition and workplace dishonesty now had a significantly harder edge. If the outsourcing arrangement was structured the way Priya was describing, this was no longer simply a conflict of interest. It was a potential violation of fiduciary duty, the kind of finding that brings investigators rather than HR advisors. I forwarded her message immediately to legal counsel with a single line attached. You may want to speak with Priya Naidu in operations before the afternoon session resumes. I set my phone face down on the table and waited. The recess ran for another 12 minutes. When the board reconvened, legal counsel had a new folder in front of him that had not been present before the break. Victor glanced at it once and looked away. I stopped watching Victor after that. I kept my attention on Howard Blaine, whose next words were going to matter for a great many people. The moment I will remember longest from that entire afternoon was not a speech or confrontation. It was a quiet knock on the boardroom door during a particularly tense silence. Howard called for the person to enter. It was Amara, standing in the doorway with a printed document in one hand and a USB drive in the other, carrying the expression of someone who had made a difficult decision and was not going back on it under any circumstances. I am sorry to interrupt, she said quietly, but I believe this is directly relevant to what is being discussed. She placed both items on the table. 14 months ago, Daniel spent 3 weeks after hours rebuilding a client data report that had been corrupted. Without it, we would have permanently lost the Fennec account. The client told me directly they were going to cancel. She paused. It was never reported because Daniel said it was better handled quietly. Victor's team later took full credit for retaining Fennec in the year-end review. She looked at me once. I gave her a small, steady nod. She left without waiting for a response. Nobody moved to examine the USB immediately. The fact of her walking in at all had already said everything. At 4:30 that afternoon, Victor's assistant knocked on the boardroom door and handed him a small folded note. He read it, stood slowly, and asked Howard for a brief recess. Howard agreed without comment. Victor walked out, and I was fairly certain it was the last time he would leave that particular room carrying the same professional title he had entered with. While the board members spoke quietly among themselves during the break, Victor appeared at the boardroom window and tilted his head toward the corridor, a clear signal for me to follow. I did. We stood near the window, the city 14 floors below. I can make this simple, Victor said, his voice stripped of its usual performance. Senior director position, full compensation, restructuring reversed. We move forward. I looked at him. I appreciate the offer, I said. But no. He frowned visibly. This situation does not need to become what it is currently becoming. I agree completely, I said. It never needed to get here at all. But it did. I paused a moment. There is one more thing you should know. I have already accepted a position elsewhere. I submitted my notice this morning. His expression changed in a way I will not describe. I turned and walked back toward the boardroom. The offer I had accepted came from a firm called Altara Group, a mid-sized operations consulting company that had spent 2 years carefully building out their client services division. 3 of their founding partners were former Cortland Solutions clients who had worked directly with me over the years and had remembered that experience clearly enough to seek me out. Their initial outreach had arrived 6 weeks before the boardroom meeting, in a message that was low pressure and specific. We are not simply offering you a role. We are offering you the kind of professional environment you should have been working in all along. I had taken 2 full weeks before responding. I discussed it with Nina on a quiet Sunday evening, sitting on our back porch with 2 cups of tea while our daughter slept. I told her everything. The boardroom meeting ahead, the restructuring coming, the decision I had made. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You have been ready to leave for 2 years. Go." What nobody at Cortland understood, not Victor, not even Howard, was that I was not fighting to keep my position. I had already let go of it. I was only ensuring I left the right way. The fallout moved faster than I had honestly expected. By Friday morning, exactly 2 days after the boardroom meeting, a formal compliance audit had been officially opened. By Friday afternoon, 2 board members had each independently submitted written statements to legal counsel. Barwell Group sent a formal letter to Howard Blaine invoking the Personnel Review Clause and requesting a complete account of all restructuring decisions made that week. 2 additional client accounts, smaller in scale but meaningful to the business, made contact asking whether their account management arrangements would be directly affected. One of those clients asked directly and by name whether I was still employed by the company. That question alone told its own story. The investor relations meeting that had been scheduled for the following Tuesday was quietly postponed without a public explanation. Victor's restructuring proposal was formally placed under review, pending the outcome of the compliance investigation. His department was instructed to suspend all active personnel transitions immediately. The replacements being trained to absorb my responsibilities were told to stop. The company, which had functioned smoothly for 11 years through quiet, consistent, largely invisible work, was beginning to feel clearly what it meant to operate without it. The final company-wide accountability meeting took place the following Monday morning. Howard Blaine called it, and attendance was required. I arrived early and chose a seat near the back of the room. Victor came in late and found a seat near the front, still instinctively reaching for the most prominent position available, even now. Howard did not waste time. He moved through the events of the past week with precision, clearly having spent significant time with legal counsel and chosen every word carefully. He addressed the documentation errors, the personnel clause, and the conflict of interest investigation. He did not name Victor in every statement. He did not need to. Victor's own words, from board presentations, internal emails, and the restructuring proposal, were read aloud by legal counsel at several critical points. Victor sat completely still. The room sat completely still. Near the end of the session, Howard turned and looked directly at me. "Daniel," he said, in front of the entire assembled company, "I want to formally acknowledge that our handling of your situation was wrong. What you demonstrated this week, in competence and in character, is exactly the standard this company should have been protecting." I nodded once. That was enough. After the meeting, several people came to find me. Former colleagues, a board member, Howard's assistant, who held my hand briefly in both of hers and said nothing at all. The person I was most glad to see was Amara. She found me near the elevator bank looking slightly overwhelmed by the morning, but standing with her shoulders straight. "Did everything work out okay?" she asked. I knew she was asking about herself as much as about me. "Yes," I said. "What you did in that room took real courage. I want you to know that." She nodded, uncertain. "Will there be consequences for me?" "Not if I have any say in it," I told her, and I meant it in the most literal sense. When Howard had asked me privately what I wanted as a formal resolution to the week's events, I had not requested a title or a financial settlement. I had made 3 specific requests: that Amara be formally protected against any retaliation, that the junior members of my former team be properly reassigned rather than quietly let go, and that the Barwell Group relationship be placed in the hands of someone genuinely capable of sustaining what had been built. Howard agreed to all 3 immediately. Felix called me on Tuesday afternoon. "I heard you are leaving Cortland," he said. "We are as well." I went quiet. "Excuse me." "We are moving the Barwell Group account," he said. "It has been under discussion for some time. Last week made the decision easier to finalize." He paused. "We would like to move the account to Altara Group. We understand that is where you will be." I sat with that for a moment before responding. "Did you know I was going to Altara?" I asked carefully. "We made some inquiries," Felix said, and I heard the faint warmth in his voice that he rarely allowed to show. He did not elaborate further. He did not need to. I knew exactly which words he was quietly referencing. The ones spoken years earlier after a crisis had been resolved, when he had told me simply that as long as I was somewhere, his company would follow. I had never chased that promise. I had never used it as leverage, not once. And here it was, arriving entirely on its own 7 years later. When I told the partners at Altara the following morning, one of them was silent for a long moment before saying quietly, "This is precisely why we came looking for you." The consequences for Victor Hale unfolded in the weeks that followed, and I was not present for most of it. I heard things secondhand from Priya, from Amara, from brief messages from former colleagues. The compliance investigation confirmed the vendor conflict of interest. Victor resigned before the board could act, though the investigation continued without him. His name was removed from project records tied to presentations he had not authored. The external vendor contracts tied to his business associate were canceled. Former allies who had stayed quiet found that the protection his influence had provided disappeared along with him. None of it produced the kind of satisfaction these stories are supposed to deliver. Victor had made his choices consistently, across years of small decisions and large ones. The consequences he ultimately faced were the natural and entirely foreseeable result of every one of those choices adding together. I had not engineered his downfall or planned for his removal. I had simply refused to disappear quietly, prepared carefully over a long period of time, and waited for the truth to do what properly documented truth always eventually does: surface clearly, on its own, without being forced into the open by anyone. 6 months later, I sat in a corner office at Altara Group on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Nina had just sent a photo from our daughter's school concert, our girl in a red dress holding a tiny violin, her face deeply serious and entirely happy. I had it as my phone wallpaper. The work at Altara was different. Not easier, exactly, but honest and clean. I was trusted with real professional autonomy. I was surrounded by people who understood that competence disconnected from integrity is not really competence at all. The Barwell Group transition had gone smoothly and better than I had anticipated. Felix and I had spoken twice already about developing a formal longer-term strategic partnership between the firms. Amara had accepted a position at Altara after one of the partners reached out to her directly based on what I had shared with him. Priya had been promoted at Cortland during the reorganization that followed Victor's departure and sent me a brief update message every few weeks. I thought sometimes about that rainy Thursday boardroom, the long table, the silence, my name on a slide. Not with bitterness. I thought about it as the turning point it was. The man once called Replaceable had quietly built something no one could replace.